The torches hiss, their flames bending against drafts that seem to come from nowhere, and in that uneasy flicker you hear it, the sound that does not belong in such splendor. Laughter, sharp and jagged. Not the laughter of joy, but of mockery. It rises and falls, colliding with the muffled gasps of pain, the sudden cries swallowed too quickly, as though someone has forced silence down the throat of agony. Together they weave a sound you cannot escape, the sound of Rome's greatest house turned into a theater of cruelty. You stand within the golden palace, a labyrinth of marble and jewels that gleam like the dwelling of a god, and yet every surface feels corrupted. Gold reflects the firelight not with warmth but with menace, turning the walls into liquid metal that threatens to drown you where you stand. Perfumed air presses in thick and suffocating, roses so cloying that you almost gag, for behind the sweetness lingers another odor, sweat, wine, and blood, faint but unmistakable. This is not a banquet hall. It is a stage. At the center of it all reclines the emperor. Draped in silks, crowned in laurels, his face glows with the light of the flames, and in that glow you do not see majesty, you see hunger. His smile is carved not in joy but in cruelty, the smirk of a man who believes suffering is art, that humiliation is theater. His hand rises, and with it the crowd bends, as if their fear were strings and he their puppeteer. This is Nero. Not the boy emperor history pretends to remember, not the artist he called himself, but the tyrant who turned Rome into his personal stage of horror. Every whisper you have heard, every rumor of cruelty, is only the surface of the nightmare. They say he married a boy, mutilated and dressed in the silks of a dead empress, paraded before the people as though grief could be conquered by mockery. They say he prowled the city at night in disguise, a hunter not of beasts but of men and women, seizing, defiling, and discarding them until dawn revealed a city that knew it could never be safe. They say he killed his own queen, not with poison or blade, but with his foot, her unborn child crushed beneath his rage. And here, in this chamber, those whispers feel alive. Every laugh that cuts the air, every cry smothered before it can rise, tells you the same truth: this is not an emperor. This is a man who crowned his own desire, who forced the empire to kneel to it, and who called that obedience love. You are not in Rome. You are in Nero's Rome. A world where gold masks cruelty, where power feasts on flesh, and where the line between pleasure and torment has been erased. This is not the story of Nero the emperor. This is the story of Nero the tyrant of desire. And once you enter, you will not leave unchanged. You are not in Rome. You are in Nero's Rome. A world where gold masks cruelty, where power feasts on flesh, and where the line between pleasure and torment has been erased. This is not the story of Nero the emperor. This is the story of Nero the tyrant of desire. And once you enter, you will not leave unchanged. When Nero first ascended to power, he was only 16 years old, an untested boy thrust onto the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever known. His mother, Agrippina, had carved the path for him, scheming and poisoning her way through rivals until her son sat where she could not. And in those early days, Rome whispered hope. A boy emperor meant malleability, promise, a fresh hand that could be guided. The Senate bowed, the legions saluted, the people cheered. But in those same shadows, his dependency was laid bare. Advisors whispered in his ear. Tutors shaped his words. His mother's hand pressed heavily upon his shoulder, steering every decision. At first, Rome saw nothing unusual in indulgence. Entertainment had long been its heartbeat. Gladiators spilled blood for cheers. Actors shed dignity for coin. Orgies in candlelit gardens blurred the boundaries of love and loyalty. But Nero did not inherit this culture as it was, he amplified it. What had once been spectacle became obsession. He looked at the gladiators' stage and saw not merely combat, but theater. He looked at intimacy and saw not connection, but domination. To him, every act was a performance, every moment an opportunity to turn flesh and fear into art. The young emperor became consumed by the stage. He studied music, dance, poetry, not as diversions but as instruments of control. He believed Rome itself could be orchestrated, that its citizens could be forced into an audience for his own desires. And in the stillness of night, he blurred the line between ruler and performer. His voice rose in song while nobles dared not cough. His body moved in plays where actors wept not because of art, but because their emperor demanded their tears. Desire, too, was theater. When Nero took a lover, it was never private. He paraded his conquests as though each kiss, each humiliation, each cruel twist of passion was another scene in the grand tragedy he was directing. He did not love. He consumed. To him, intimacy was not two bodies meeting but one body kneeling, breaking, surrendering to prove his power. And Rome, caught in the glow of his golden palace, learned quickly that even the private could be commanded, displayed, and mocked before the world. The shadows of Rome deepened under his reign. By day, the people gathered in circuses and theaters, cheering the spectacles he paid for with their sweat and blood. By night, the same people whispered in corners, fearful of his footsteps echoing through their alleys, uncertain if the emperor's hunger would fall upon them next. The empire's wealth was poured into extravagance, its dignity stripped in exchange for his fantasies. Rome itself had become his stage, its citizens both actors and victims. And yet, history reminds us, silence feeds the tyrant. Rome endured because too many looked away, too many bowed their heads, too many laughed nervously at his jokes when what they should have done was resist. Most people will watch this and scroll away, but if you truly believe history should never be buried, then prove it. Subscribe now, or at least have the courage to say in the comments why you'd rather stay silent while others keep this story alive. For in Nero's Rome, silence was complicity. And even now, silence ensures that his story is forgotten, while his shadow lingers. The shadows of Rome deepened under his reign. By day, the people gathered in circuses and theaters, cheering the spectacles he paid for with their sweat and blood. By night, the same people whispered in corners, fearful of his footsteps echoing through their alleys, uncertain if the emperor's hunger would fall upon them next. The empire's wealth was poured into extravagance, its dignity stripped in exchange for his fantasies. Rome itself had become his stage, its citizens both actors and victims. And then came the act that silenced even the loudest of whispers. Sporus was a boy when Nero's gaze fell upon him. Young, delicate, and cursed with a resemblance that chilled those who noticed. For in the boy's face, in the slope of his cheek, in the quiet of his eyes, Nero saw not just innocence but the shadow of Poppaea, the empress he had once claimed to love, the woman he had struck down in a rage so violent it ended both her life and that of the child she carried within her. Poppaea was gone, but Nero's hunger for her had not been buried with her body. And so he made a choice that Rome would remember with equal parts horror and disbelief. The boy was seized. His body was taken, reshaped, mutilated to fit the emperor's desire. Castration was not punishment, not medicine, it was transformation. Nero carved the boy into an echo of the woman he had lost, as though flesh could be bent into memory, as though pain could conjure resurrection. When the screams faded, Sporus no longer belonged to himself. He belonged entirely to Nero's vision. But Nero was not content with secrecy. No, he demanded an audience. A wedding was proclaimed. Senators, soldiers, commoners alike gathered as if to witness an imperial union. And before them all, in silks that once belonged to Poppaea, veils hiding the youth of his face, Sporus was led forth. A boy, broken and remade, paraded not as himself but as a queen resurrected. The vows were spoken. Nero placed a ring upon his hand. The people cheered, but beneath the sound of celebration ran something darker. The shuffle of uneasy feet, the murmur of disbelief, the knowledge that what they saw was both comedy and tragedy, cruelty and theater intertwined. For some, it was laughter. For others, it was horror. But all of Rome knew that day that their emperor could take a child, rip away his manhood, and crown him as his bride without fear of consequence. Historians would not let this moment pass quietly. Suetonius wrote of it, almost with disgust. Cassius Dio confirmed it, a note of revulsion in his account. Tacitus, too, left fragments of the story scattered across his record of Rome's decay. They struggled to capture the weight of it, for how could words convey the sight of a boy forced to mimic the dead, to step into the silks of a woman beaten into her grave, to smile as though he had chosen it? The symbolism was inescapable. Nero had reshaped not only flesh but identity. He refused to let death take what he believed was his. He defied nature itself, demanding the living body of a boy become the ghost of a woman. It was not love, it was possession. It was not grief, it was hunger. And for Rome, it was a reminder that their emperor saw no limit, no boundary, no sanctity in life or death that could resist him. This was not merely cruelty. It was spectacle. And for the citizens forced to watch, laughter was safer than silence, but silence was safer than defiance. So they laughed, they whispered, they endured. And in their endurance, Nero grew bolder. If this shocked you, remember, this is only one of the horrors. And if you can listen but refuse to subscribe, ask yourself, are you any different from the Romans who watched in silence while it happened? Leave your excuse in the comments. When the torches of the Golden Palace burned low and Rome slipped into uneasy sleep, Nero's hunger did not rest with them. By day he wore his crown, but by night he wore masks. The Emperor of Rome, Lord of legions, master of lands stretching from Britain to Judea, would shed his silks and don the skins of beasts, or the coarse rags of common men. Disguised, he descended into the streets, not as a ruler guarding his people, but as a predator searching for prey. The alleys of Rome were narrow, their shadows deep. Citizens walked quickly, heads lowered, praying to pass unseen. Yet the darkness was no protection. A hand would seize them, strong, merciless, dragging them into corners where the torchlight could not follow. Sometimes it was women who vanished into the shadows with him, their cries stifled before they could call for help. Sometimes it was men, overpowered, their dignity stripped as swiftly as their safety. All who crossed him in those moments became unwilling players in a twisted hunt staged for no audience but his own hunger. When the assaults were done, when the bruises and terror were left behind in the dust, Nero would return to the palace laughing. The laughter carried through marble halls, echoing in the ears of those who dared not question where he had been. For him, the night's cruelty was amusement. For Rome, it was terror. No one was safe, not women, not men, not even the innocent who thought themselves too unremarkable to draw imperial attention. To walk the streets after dark was to gamble with fate itself, for the emperor could be anywhere, disguised not by power but by shadow. The boundary between ruler and criminal dissolved with every step he took into those alleys. An emperor was meant to protect, to uphold order. Nero inverted the role. He became the fear that stalked his people, the embodiment of lawlessness with the shield of law wrapped around him. His victims could not speak, to accuse him was death. So they suffered in silence, and silence fed his sense of invincibility. For Nero, this was not madness but mastery. To dominate men and women alike, to steal their will in the night, was proof that his reach was limitless. He was not content to be worshipped in daylight. He demanded to be feared in darkness. Sexual violence, for him, was not a crime but a declaration, that he alone owned Rome, body and soul, public and private, light and shadow. It's easier to laugh at Nero's madness than to face it. If you think this kind of history doesn't matter, don't subscribe. But if you do care, subscribe to Tale of History, and let the others explain in the comments why they'd rather remain blind. The story of Poppaea Sabina is one of beauty destroyed under the heel of power. She was not just Nero's wife, she was the woman he once paraded as the pinnacle of Roman elegance, the mistress who became empress after he forced his first wife, Octavia, into exile and death. Poppaea was ambitious, cunning, and radiant. But she was also fragile in ways Nero could never understand, and her final days would reveal the horror that came when desire met unchecked rage. The account passed down is both simple and unspeakable. In a moment of fury, as Poppaea, pregnant with their child, dared to criticize him, Nero lashed out. A kick, brutal and unrestrained, landed on her stomach. The empress fell. And just like that, life was stolen, hers, and the unborn child's. Rome would whisper that it was no accident, that Nero's cruelty was not a sudden blaze but a slow-burning fire that had always been smoldering. But the story does not end with her death. In truth, it begins there. For what followed was far darker than murder. Nero, unable to let go, ordered her body preserved, not with the humble rites of Rome, but with extravagance that verged on the grotesque. Her corpse was embalmed in rare spices and drenched in perfumes, so that even in death, she would remain a spectacle. Some said it was the first act of necrophilia whispered in the annals of an emperor's life. For the scent of roses and cinnamon could not mask the stench of possession. And possession was the heart of it. Nero did not grieve Poppaea as a husband mourns his wife. He grieved her as a child rages over a broken toy. He loved her beauty, yes, but only as an extension of himself, a thing to command, a thing to control. When she could no longer serve that role, he did not bury her image. He resurrected it. And he would go to unthinkable lengths to recreate her. Here enters Sporus, the boy Nero castrated, dressed, and paraded as Poppaea reborn. To Rome, it was a carnival of madness, a circus of flesh and delusion. To Nero, it was the perfect correction, a wife who would never age, never betray, never talk back. Imagine the chilling implication, an emperor who would rather mutilate a child than accept that death had stolen his empress. Love twisted into violence, and violence twisted into ritual. Nero turned grief into theater, mourning into obsession. What Rome saw as grotesque parody, he believed to be triumph over mortality itself. In his hands, death was not an ending but a stage prop, bent to the will of an emperor who refused to lose control. And so Poppaea's memory lingered, not as a queen remembered fondly, but as a ghost chained to Nero's madness. Her death was not release, but imprisonment. For even in the tomb, she was not free. If you can listen to this and still not subscribe, then admit it in the comments, because silence is a choice. You're either preserving these stories with us, or you're letting them rot like Poppaea's memory. When the fires of Rome reduced much of the city to cinders, Nero did not rebuild for the people, he rebuilt for himself. Out of ash and ruin rose the Domus Aurea, the golden house, a palace so vast and extravagant that its glittering halls seemed more like the lair of a god than the residence of a man. Marble from distant lands lined the walls, ceilings sparkled with gems, and dining rooms had mechanisms to rain down flowers and perfume on the guests below. But what shone brightest was not gold, it was the cruel theater of human degradation staged within. Feasts stretched for days. Banquets were arranged where food was almost secondary, the true spectacle was power. Guests, senators, even nobles, men and women of pedigree, were forced into humiliating performances. The dining tables blurred into stages, where the emperor decided who would embrace whom, who would crawl, who would be stripped of dignity before hundreds of watching eyes. These were not acts of passion, but of domination, orchestrated by a man who believed Rome itself existed for his entertainment. Suetonius whispers of scenes where men were paired with men, women with women, and even slaves with senators, all on command. To refuse was to risk disgrace or worse, for Nero's laughter was sharper than a blade, and his wrath heavier than chains. The Golden Palace was no sanctuary, it was a cage gilded in jewels. And at its center, Nero played the master of ceremonies, watching with detached fascination as bodies became props, as pleasure became punishment. His palace was not merely a house, it was a mirror of his mind, glittering on the surface, but dark, cavernous, and terrifying within. For those caught inside, there was no escape. To walk its halls was to know that beauty could become cruelty at any moment, and that the emperor's smile could be more deadly than a sword. You've come this far into the Golden Palace. If you won't subscribe now, then at least confess in the comments why you refuse to carry the torch of history forward with us. But if you do care, subscribe, because Tale of History will not let Rome's darkest secrets be forgotten. Rome burned for 9 days. Flames devoured entire districts, black smoke strangled the sky, and the cries of the desperate echoed through streets that crumbled into ash. The Great Fire of 64 AD did not just consume homes and temples, it consumed trust. Whispers spread that Nero himself had ordered it, that he had stood on a tower as the city died beneath him, plucking strings of a lyre and singing of Troy's destruction while his own people choked in the inferno. When the flames finally relented, what rose from the ruins was not mercy, but spectacle. Families who had lost everything were herded into hastily built shelters, only to see their emperor turn the charred skeleton of Rome into a stage for his excess. Where smoke still lingered, Nero hosted celebrations, lavish feasts in the shadow of ruin. Survivors became props in his theater of power, forced to dance, drink, and obey, their grief mocked by the glitter of his reborn empire. The palace he erected from the ashes, the Domus Aurea, was less a home than a proclamation. Rome's pain had become Nero's playground. But a scapegoat was needed, and Nero found it in a small, rising sect, the Christians. Already distrusted, their refusal to worship Rome's gods made them easy prey. Nero unleashed punishments that blurred the line between execution and perverse entertainment. Men and women were stripped, tied to stakes, and coated in pitch, their burning bodies lighting Nero's gardens at night. Others were forced into arenas, their humiliation entwined with torture, as lions tore them apart before jeering crowds. Sexual degradation was never far from the cruelty. Women were violated before being slaughtered. Men were forced into grotesque positions before being beaten and executed. These punishments were not just about death, they were about shame, the destruction of identity before the destruction of flesh. As paranoia deepened, Nero's mind grew more unstable, more unmoored. He began to see betrayal everywhere, among senators, among his own family, even Each execution was followed by another, each humiliation more vicious than the last. His lovers became captives of his mood swings. Desire for him was no longer intimacy, but submission under threat of death. He forced marriages that were nothing but prisons, demanded obedience that was nothing but enslavement. The emperor who once sang to Rome now presided over its moral collapse. Rome mirrored him, glittering, unstable, terrified. The empire that had conquered the world now trembled under one man's appetite for control. His palace was full of laughter, but it was the laughter of fear, echoing in chambers lined with stolen gold. His festivals were vibrant, but they reeked of smoke from the pyres of the condemned. Nero's decadence was not merely personal, it was Rome itself rotting from the inside out, its beauty masking a corpse. You've walked with us through fire, through cruelty, through the fall of dignity itself. If you can stomach this truth yet refuse to subscribe, ask yourself why choose silence while history screams? Subscribe now, and let Tale of History ensure these shadows are never buried again. But even nightmares collapse. Rome itself began to shudder under the weight of the monster it had created. The whispers that once trembled in secret corners grew into open defiance. Provinces rebelled. Generals once loyal to the crown now raised their banners against him. In the Senate, the very stage where Nero's ancestors had stood as guardians of Rome's law, voices cracked with rage and fear. They no longer called him emperor. They called him enemy of the state. The Golden House, with its shimmering halls and hidden cruelties, became a prison. Nero wandered through it like a ghost, surrounded by marble, yet more alone than the lowest slave in Rome. He begged his friends to stand by him, but one by one, they fled. The Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to defend his life, melted into the shadows, deserting him without shame. And so, the master of Rome, who had bent bodies and souls to his will, found himself hunted like an animal. Panic became his crown, and despair his throne. He fled the city in disguise, clothed not in gold but in rags, seeking sanctuary in the house of a freedman. Yet even there, the sound of approaching hoofbeats haunted him, the pounding echo of justice finally closing in. It was in this place, stripped of the empire's grandeur, that Nero faced the end. With no one left to kill for him, no servant brave enough to carry out his last command, he held the dagger himself. And as it pressed against his throat, he uttered words as chilling as they are unforgettable, qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. Not a statesman. Not a soldier. Not even a man. An artist, of horror, of excess, of cruelty. That was the legacy he chose to leave Rome. When the blade pierced his flesh, it was not just the life of a tyrant that ended. It was the dissonant song of Rome itself, caught between its brilliance and its depravity. He died at the age of 30, young, and yet ancient in corruption. But death did not erase the memory. Historians would not let him vanish into silence. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, they kept his story alive, not merely as a warning, but as an indictment. Nero was remembered not just as a tyrant, but as something more terrifying, a monster who blurred the boundaries between art and atrocity, who painted Rome's stage with the colors of blood, lust, and fire. And so his ghost lingers, not in temples or triumphal arches, but in the unease of laughter that sounds too sharp, in the memory of flames that devour without reason, in the twisted beauty of power unrestrained. Rome survived him. But it never forgot him. And perhaps, neither have we. You've walked through fire and shadows with us, down into the pit where Rome's glory became Rome's shame. If this story chills you, then prove it. Subscribe to Tale of History, not for us, but because silence keeps monsters alive. Break the silence. Carry the torch forward. The story of Nero does not end with the sword that struck him down, nor with the silence of the grave into which he fled. It lingers, heavy, like smoke that clings long after the fire has died. His reign is not merely a chapter of Rome's history, it is a mirror of what happens when desire becomes law, when cruelty masquerades as art, when power is permitted to remake morality in its own image. Rome tolerated him for years. Senators bowed, soldiers obeyed, citizens cheered his games. And why? Because spectacle dulled their outrage. Laughter muffled their fear. Bread and entertainment numbed the voice of conscience. It was only when the empire itself began to tear, when rebellion grew louder than applause, that they finally declared him a monster. But by then, the damage was irreversible. What Nero leaves us is not just the memory of one man's depravity. It is the warning of what silence permits. When no one speaks, cruelty thrives. When people trade truth for comfort, empires rot from within. The marble halls of his golden palace may have crumbled, but the pattern remains eternal. You can see it in every age, rulers who rewrite morality, audiences who prefer theater to truth, witnesses who look away until the stage is soaked in blood. And yet, he is remembered. Not because Rome wished to remember, but because some chose to write. Suetonius, Tacitus, whispers of slaves and scribes, all of them carried fragments of his nightmare forward. That is why you know his name now. That is why, centuries later, you can still feel the echo of his laughter in the ruins. History survives only when someone refuses to let silence bury it. The question now is not what Nero was. The question is whether you will allow his shadow to fade, or whether you will keep the torch lit. If you made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're a witness. And witnesses have a duty. Subscribe to Tale of History to make sure stories like this never die. And if you choose not to, then at least have the courage to step into the comments and explain why you'd rather let the past vanish into silence.